Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Kelsey Belahowski, and I am the Learning and Community Engagement Curator at the Vernon Public Art Gallery. I'm happy to welcome you to another UBCO BFA Grad Arts Talk. I'd just like to take a second before we begin to acknowledge that I'm currently situated on unceded Syilx territory. And the Vernon Public Art Gallery is pretty excited. Over the next few weeks, we are hosting artist talks for 3 of the UBCO Visual Arts 4th year grad students. So due to COVID-19, as you may or may not know, their year-end graduation exhibition has not been in person, and it's only accessible virtually. So we are just offering a virtual artist talk to complement this. We will be recording this talk and posting it online. So if you are uncomfortable with your audio or video being on, just make sure you turn it off. You can do that in the bottom corner. I will probably end up turning them off if they are on during Angela's talk, but during the Q&A period, feel free to turn them back on to ask Angela any questions that you may have. So we have Angela Gmeinweser. Did I say that right?
That was pretty good. It's Gmeinweser.
Sorry, okay, yeah, we have Angela here tonight. So she's a recent UBCO graduate with a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree. Her main mediums include painting, installation, sculpture, and audio. And she plans to move to Vancouver for a Master's of Architecture soon. So let's give her a warm virtual welcome, and I will let you take it away, Angela.
Hi, everyone. So I'm just gonna see if I can share my screen. Oh, I think I need to have screen sharing enabled.
Oh, let's see. Sorry about that, guys. Let me know if that works here. Are you good to go now?
Oh yeah, I think it's working now.
Okay, perfect. There we go.
Okay. So thanks everyone for coming. It's really nice to see that so many people made it out. And that feels like a really nice compliment. So thank you. So I thought I would start this talk by what somebody else said about my work, because I feel like it's almost a little bit better said than the writing I was doing about my own work. So we, for the 4th year class, we worked with artist and writer from Vancouver, Michele Weinstein, to help put our work into context. And so she wrote about my work that the endless translation of spatialized events gives this chain of artworks their own history, their own seed of life, a set of art memories that hovers aside that of the lived memory, their own origami spaces unfolding and revealing, leading to the next. So I guess I liked this way of putting my work into context, and yeah, I wanted to get started talking about that, but then I think also it's important just to be able to understand what I'm talking about later, to go back to 2017, where I started working with what's called like relational aesthetics. So I was interested in sculptures that people could interact with and touch, and how that changed the meaning of the work. So this is one example of one of these pieces where I constructed a floor that had speakers underneath, and then viewers could walk on the surface, and then the audio from the speakers was really only you could really only hear it if you were lying against the floor with your ear to it. So I thought it was kind of interesting to ask people to change their relationship to the sculpture in that way. And then there's this one where I was thinking about a flight I took down to Phoenix in 2016 to see my mom, and it was nighttime, and I looked out the window and I just saw this kind of one spot of light sort of traveling along the ground in this really crazy pattern, and I realized it was a river. And I remember thinking that was kind of a really interesting signifier of being in a certain space, like suspended over the earth. So I thought it would be interesting if I could bring that into a sculpture. So I built this river into this sculpture that people could walk around and and eat the oranges if they wanted to. Yeah, and then so I guess I've always, well, not always, but like for the duration of my bachelor's degree, I worked between painting and sculpture kind of separately. I guess I felt like I couldn't really decide between the two. And in this piece, I constructed a model and then did a painting observing the model from the top. And this painting feels significant because I think it's the first time I really started to think about the relationship between objects and architecture and how that could convey emotion. So there's that one. And then this is the last older work that I'm going to talk about. And I started as a realist painter, and I think as time went on, I had a really hard time making anything other than that. Every time I tried to start a new painting, I would just kind of copy a photograph or something that existed in front of me. So I thought about things that I'm kind of better at when it came to imagination. And it happened, I guess maybe it's like that with everybody, I don't know, but when I think about the future especially, I feel like I'm quite often wrong, and will create these fantasies that that could never be true. So this painting was about Toulouse, because in 2017 I applied to go on an exchange to Toulouse and was accepted. And as soon as I found out I was accepted, I started imagining this strange city, and people kept on telling me that it's called the Pink City, and in my mind it was like this vibrant pink city. So I did a painting thinking about that, and then kind of used that as a way of escaping from just representing reality. And then so I actually went on the exchange, and so this is an image of the capital in Toulouse, and I think this exchange influenced me and my work in quite a few different ways, but most specifically, I became really interested in how spaces could be, their identities could change so quickly depending on what people were doing within the space. So I chose this image as an example because in my time in Toulouse, I witnessed this space become the Christmas market. And it was also, so when I was in France, there was quite a bit of political unrest, and there what was called the Gilets jaunes protests. So every Saturday, people who weren't happy with the government would go out and put on yellow vests and protest in the square, and there was the military and tear gas. So thinking about this scene next to the Christmas market seemed really kind of intriguing to me. And then sometimes the square was just empty. So spaces like this really started to have an impact on me. And then the next thing that really changed me about Toulouse was there wasn't really the same studio space that I was used to at UBC or at UBC Okanagan. I kind of expected there to be a wood shop so I could keep on making those same sculptures that people could walk on or interact with. And I remember asking people where the studios were, and they were like, you work at home, like chez toi. So this is an image of my studio at home. And just to give some context, my bed is up above here, and this painting is hanging from it. So it's a very small place. But I think like that experience really challenged me to work between mediums and stop defining myself just because I was making one certain type of work. So yeah, I started making smaller watercolor paintings and referencing spaces, and I think I became quite interested in kind of the moment before I really understood what I was seeing, because it felt a little bit like kind of the understanding of space was parallel to me learning French. And so in the beginning, I really had no idea what was going on. And I think that my work started reflecting that. So there's another example. And then I also became interested in layering moments on top of each other and using the architectural space to kind of be a container for the people and gestures within it. Um, yeah. So I'm just gonna play this video that I made in Toulouse, and then afterwards I'll just explain what I was thinking. Okay, so I made this video of my own feet walking through Toulouse because I realized that I was really missing being able to take up a lot of space, like I was able to with sculpture. And then I started asking myself if it was possible to take up space with something that was immaterial. And yeah, and I found that this video was interesting to me because of the ways that are the signifiers that kind of told me where I was. I tried not to pay attention to what was going around me, so I just was looking at shadows to try to understand where people were, and things like that cigarette that was still smoking. I felt like they held a lot more meaning when that was the only thing that I could see. And then I was also interested in how audio could change my perception of space. Okay. And then finally, the last thing about this exchange that really impacted me was I walked the Camino de Compostela with my friend Maggie Luthen, who is actually in this talk today. So, hi Maggie. Yeah, and I feel like this walk really changed my relationship to my work and kind of imposed a rhythm on me that I had never experienced before. So this is me and Maggie, and this is a photo of all the shoes of the pilgrims that were staying in this one hostel that we were at for the night. And I guess this situation or this experience was significant because I never experienced having each day sort of being my first day and my last day in a space. Because we were walking and staying in a new place every night. Everything was always changing, and the only thing that I brought with me for entertainment was this sketchbook. So I didn't bring any music or anything to listen to. And I found that the sketchbook became a way for me to understand what I was looking at, and also kind of cope with maybe the anxiety of not really understanding where I was all the time. So I felt like, I mean, in a way the days were really simple. Like it was just about finding somewhere to do my laundry and cook dinner and sleep. But then within all of that, it felt like a lot of moving parts, and then so many different ways of interpreting space or how to live in space. Yeah. And then in returning to Canada after this exchange, I experienced a lot of reverse culture shock, which I did not expect. But it was definitely a real thing for me where I really didn't know what to make anymore, because it felt like going back to what I made in my second year just wasn't possible. But then the way I was working in Toulouse didn't really feel solid enough for where I was. So I just started making these collections of objects that for me felt like held some sort of narrative, and for me, like, it was still, they still held some spatial reference, even though it was maybe a bit less obvious. For example, like I started, or I went hunting with my dad, or not really hunting, I don't hunt, but we shot Tim Hortons cups, so very Canadian. But then that's how I collected these 22 shells and then combined it with these other objects. And this assembly was a combination of seashells that I brought back from France and potato chips from the vending machine at school. And then I started combining them into these structures, sort of similar to what I did before I left for France, but I was thinking about this as the final product now and not just the painting. And then I also rediscovered this sketchbook, and I thought, well, what would it be like to translate this into something that's relevant, or that was relevant to my present? So I made this painting. I wonder, this is in the way. Yeah, so I made this painting. And I think like what's significant about working this way was, actually, I think the best way I can describe it is Michele Weinstein, the writer who wrote about our fourth year show. She told me about Walter Benjamin's essay on translations, and he said something about how when you're translating, you're seeking to convey an echo of the original in the new thing that you're making, and it's not about reproducing each element separately, but more just accessing some core seed of meaning. So this painting kind of felt a little bit like that. So it was referencing the original drawing, but then kind of going somewhere a little bit different. And then this is just another example. So in the book, I'd also write down how many kilometers we'd walked in a day. And I think that it was nice that they weren't entirely complete drawings, because then I had a little bit more freedom later on. Yeah. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about Susan Lichtman's work. So she's an artist who's, or a painter who's influenced me for quite a few years now, but especially this year I started looking at her work for the way that she divides spaces through light. And I feel like that does a really good job of communicating meaning between the figures within the work. And then kind of later on in the year, I started making paintings that were, I think they were more generated by making marks and then responding to those marks. So not necessarily a memory, but it still kind of felt like trying to like pull out meaning from something that was already there. And this is another artist that I really like, named Corey Lynn Tetz. And I like her work for the way that she communicates emotion between environments and people in scenes that are a little bit more ambiguous than I would normally be comfortable with making myself. So later on in the year, I started to move towards paintings more like this, where they were still either referencing like a memory or a dream or an idea, but throughout the process, I was responding more to the brushstrokes, and then the painting kind of became its own thing. And I was also, what was most interesting about this painting is that some of the elements of the figures almost seemed structural or part of the environment, so that the two started to blend together. And then making this small little maquette ended up changing quite a bit about how I was working, because so I made it based off of a drawing that I had done in Paris, because I wanted to reference it for a painting. I wanted to light it from different angles and see what I could do with it, but then I kind of became just as interested in the painting, or in this, as I did the painting. And it felt like it felt the same as, say, like speaking in French and English about the same object or the same concept, where the lines are completely the same, and yet I know that they're different objects. Yeah, and then so from those two works, I ended up making this larger scale installation that I guess is a little bit more in line with what I was making in my second year, but expanded more on the, not really research, but the interest that I took in audio in Toulouse. So I'll just play this for you now, and then I'll explain a little bit more after. I stand by the wall where the islands overflow, and I think of a little darling where there's not this long journey that brings me forth, nor the country I live in, nor the dance that I own. There is one thing that brings me and troubles alone. It's leaving Princeton way back behind. Yeah, so first off, I want to say thanks to Maggie Luthen for letting me use this recording of her singing Pretty Sarah. So after I decided to use this song in the piece, I did some more research on it and found out that it was originally a British song that reappeared in colonial America. But I found it strange that the first time I heard it was in Spain or in France, I can't remember. But so far from either of those places, and then combining that with the shapes of the Gothic architecture that I had seen in France, it felt kind of significant. And then also to reference it with traditional Canadian building materials felt kind of like another layer of meaning that I think I still need to flesh out a bit. But I remember growing up, and my dad would do renovations on old houses, and seeing scenes a little bit like this with the raw wood was pretty common. So yeah, it felt significant to be able to reference those spaces with this material. Yeah, and I guess one more thing about that installation. So I started thinking about how the quality of like the resonance in the audio could describe a space, and I started thinking about that because I visited these caves in France called Les Grottes de Nio, and there are multiple chambers in these caves, but then there are the most cave paintings in this one space, and there are theories about why that is, and one of them is that the reverberation in there is really quite incredible. There are two extra antechambers over top of the ones with the paintings, and it makes the reverberation really quite intense. And I think that when I was there, it really felt like when someone was speaking or singing, it felt like that was what was completing the space for me, and not really the visuals. So then after that, I started thinking more about the models I was doing as the finished product. So I referenced this drawing through this small model. I can't really see it. Yeah, and so I started with this one, and then kind of started making a series that got a little bit out of hand. Like one space led to the next, and I started hanging them from the ceiling because I was running out of space. And at this point, my teachers challenged me to make as many as possible within 2 weeks, and I think I was shooting for 30, and I think I got pretty close to that mark. So they range from spaces that I knew really well. For example, this is a model of my childhood home. And then there was also spaces like this one, which didn't exist at all. I just, I had some offcuts from a 3D printer and ended up gluing them together. Yeah, and then this one was referencing a building in Ottawa. And I feel a little bit embarrassed to show this, but this is what my studio looked like. It really got kind of out of hand. There were spaces on the walls and on the floor. But I think that this process was really important just to be able to flesh out all the possible ideas I had, and then with the goal of maybe making something new after all of this. So the collection of spaces really started to remind me of Sarah Say's work. She's an artist that I really like, who will take really almost unrelated objects and really banal things and combine them into these worlds that have their own system of meaning. So I was thinking about work like hers, and also David Altmed in works where he would take like a big plexiglass cube and then fill it with different objects. And I think that what's interesting with this work is that the materials are pretty unrelated, but then within the assembly, they start to make sense next to each other. So this was my first attempt at scaling up the smaller models to a larger scale, to an installation. And I guess what's different from this and then the other installations is this one was really quite generative and happened from responding to decisions that I had already made within the same structure. So this was the direction I thought I was going before COVID happened. And then in one weekend, I had to move all of my materials home. And I feel really grateful to my roommate for giving me so much room in the garage. But yeah, this space became my new studio for the last month of my fourth year. And yeah, for the first week, I really had to step back and take stock of what I wanted to be making in this time. But I chose just to focus on painting because it just seemed to fit the ideas better that I was having. And I also wanted just to feature this cat who came to visit me every day. Yeah, so it's good to have support. So this is the first painting that I did in quarantine. And for me, what I see is the combination of my roommate's dog sleeping on the floor and the mountains in Spain. And it felt interesting to be able to combine these two spaces together because they seemed so opposite to me. And I think originally I was wanting to continue to reference spaces that I had drawn in the previous year, but especially earlier on in the quarantine, I was spending so much time at home that the domestic space just kind of crept in, and like watching the dog sleep on the floor with the light from the blinds falling on him was really interesting. So yeah, pairing that with the mountains in Spain felt significant. And then in this work, I was really thinking about the moment that felt the most different or the complete opposite from where I found myself when I was making it. So I was thinking about this moment where I was backpacking in France in the springtime, and we had been walking for 3 days, and it was the morning, and I remember walking into this tiny town and there was a field and then there was a bunch of people in the field just kind of staring at the ground. And I was like, whoa, that is so interesting. What are they doing? And then I realized that it was Easter and they were just doing an Easter egg hunt. So this felt significant because I think this is the closest I've ever come to seeing my own culture from the outside. And it felt like the space the furthest away that I could represent because I was speaking a different language. I was in a different country. And when I was making the work, I was feeling very close to where I started in almost kind of a disconcerting sort of way. Yeah, and then so just to, this is like the last series of work that I'm going to talk about. So in one of the spaces I started to, or in the model spaces, I started to make like train sort of bus spaces. And I found them interesting because when I think about structural environments, I think about cliffs and built architecture. I don't really think about spaces of transit, but then that ended up being one of the spaces that I spent the most time in, kind of inadvertently. So then this influenced the painting I'm just going to show after this. And also, so within those spaces, I think the way of experiencing the world really influenced me because, for example, with this image, I remember being so impressed that I could see the mountains in front of me and the city behind me at the same time just because of the reflection. And it was also a space that I had heard about before I had ever visited. I had a friend who was living along the coast of Spain, and they wrote letters to me describing what it was like, and they talked about oranges and people getting drinks after work. But then this reality that I saw was really like the highway and orchards, and it felt like the same thing, but just almost like in a different language or with a different medium. So then experiences like this led to this final work. And I chose to end on this one just because I think that I can see carrying on from this work with more sculptures or paintings, and it feels the most, I guess, active out of all the paintings that I've done lately. And I think it is particularly valuable because, again, like I think people in the structural environment are starting to kind of converge in a way that I find interesting, and yeah, and that's kind of where I want to go with the future of my work. So that's the end of my presentation. So maybe we can move on to questions.
Awesome, thanks, Angela. That's great. I'm excited that you are going to be going to architecture school because the maquettes and things that you've created are so visually interesting. So I'm excited to see what your future holds. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to either ask them in the chat bar, or you can unmute yourself and turn on your video and talk to Angela that way, whatever you feel comfortable with.
I have a question.
Hey, Alicia.
Hi, Angela. Going back to the video of your footsteps walking around, I found it interesting when you mentioned that cigarette had more meaning for you behind it, as opposed to like when you saw everything else around it, like just that one little visual of it put much more meaning behind it. But could it also be that it technically has an infinite amount of possible meanings behind it because you don't know like its story of how it got there?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely. In Toulouse, I think I started realizing just how subjective my reality was, and that was quite scary, but also really intriguing. And I think like that cigarette had meaning to me, especially because I think I was struggling to understand a lot of other cues that I would normally be able to understand quite easily. Like I can't remember if I was still struggling to understand French then, but I found that in the beginning, especially, I would just kind of like attach to this one thing that seemed to carry meaning because that was the only thing I could understand.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, trying to like piece everything together just based off of that one little glimmer that you understood or kind of focused on.
Yeah, exactly.
So putting your meaning up around a focal point as opposed to a picture and then focusing on something.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, I have a question. If it's over.
Oh, Mel, you're here?
I've been here since the start.
Oh, I didn't see you. Hello.
Hello.
Welcome.
Yeah, it's nice to see your art once again. I have a question about the the big installation with the construction type materials.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, with the one of the singing,
Yeah.
that was that was yours, right?
Yeah.
Good. So my question, you look confused. So my question was I noticed that with the cigarette stuff and the walking, you navigated by shadows. And when I saw your work there with the singing, I was wondering whether the shadows made it, you thought about the shadows when you were doing the work as well with the lighting and everything, that if that played into it, or
Oh, interesting. Not originally. So I installed that work so it could be documented. And I remember turning on the lights and being like, oh crap, there's way too many. And they're yeah, the shadows are going all over the place. But I think that in the end, I really liked how it kind of made the space feel bigger. And it felt like a little bit of, or it felt like the same thing I was trying to do with the audio, was describe a space that wasn't necessarily physical but could still be experienced.
that's cool. Yeah, I don't know why for me I just started focusing on the shadows more than the installation itself, what they made, just because maybe because you kind of talked about following, walking and following the shadows and stuff, so that's why I started thinking about that after.
Well,
But
that's
yeah, that's cool.
interesting. Wow. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mel.
I have a question after that one, because also I've watched your art through the last year, and the shadows really did. I remember looking at them and how different lights would hit the shadows, and I'm just wondering, with your experiences in France, did that influence that work? Because I remember you fooling around with the shadows around your work, and it was just fabulous. It really took off and filled that space with a lot more dynamic look.
Oh, interesting. So you're asking if being in France influenced how I was working with the shadows,
or did that build up for that? Because I just found then that part of your work this you're very intriguing, because and did you those steps and things that you did, and the openings and everything, it just seemed to be influencing on the shapes of shadow and everything. And I was wondering if that was an intentional thing, or did that just kind of develop along?
I think it developed because I felt really drawn to them, and it's true, Toulouse is really, I don't know exactly why. I think it was sunny quite often, and then also the infrastructure is quite a bit different from Kelowna, where the buildings are a lot closer together. And even a friend of mine told me that the reason they did that was to protect people from the sun in the summertime. But I found that there would be these really, I don't actually, there's a word in French that describes it really well. It's lumière rasante, and it's the cutting light. And yeah, so I think that those experiences, just being in the city, did influence it quite a bit. And I remember skipping school just so that I could walk around and experience things. So it's interesting, maybe it did influence my later work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Hey, Angela.
Hey, Andre.
So you mentioned one of your sculptures. I haven't changed it yet. You mentioned that for the Gothic sculpture, you haven't quite fleshed out the meaning yet. I was just wondering, during your process, how does the meaning evolve? And when you finish your work, does it have a different meaning?
Oh, wow, that's very deep. Yeah, I think it always feels like it's changing. I mean, at a certain point, I think that I need to kind of let it go and move on. But I think that the meaning can change depending on who's looking at the work. And it also changes for me if I learn more about the history of what I'm working with. For example, that song, just learning the history of it, beginning in England and then reappearing in America. like that kind of changed the meaning for me. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to use it because I didn't want it to feel like I was celebrating colonization, because in a way, like that's the lyrics are talking about this person who's moved to this new land who misses their love, but it still felt personal enough that maybe it didn't, it wasn't celebrating colonization. I hope it doesn't, but I think that depending on how much I learn about the meaning behind the materials and that kind of thing, like that will change how I see the work, probably forever.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Do you have a question?
Oh yeah, so how, when someone else looks at your work, do you want to, like you really guided us through your journey with your works today, but when someone comes into your installment, do you want them to read about it first, or do you want them to experience it and gain their own meaning first?
I think it's maybe a little bit more interesting for me if they don't read what I said, or if they don't know that much about it, because then it's really just the work that's active. But I don't know. I think it depends. Like I was thinking about how especially with the more ambiguous paintings, I think I would like to leave them a little bit more open. But then I figured for this talk, it would be good just to be honest and talk about what I was thinking. And then I don't really think it cancels out what other people see, though. So.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the questions.
You have a question from Vanna in the chat. She said, you seem to be using a very similar palette in the paintings you did over the last 2 years. Is there something meaningful or intentional in forming your palette decisions?
Oh, interesting. Probably more just intuition. I'm sure there's something going on, but I think because since I started making paintings by referencing the last one, it almost became like a sort of like elements that are formed from the same chain. So I think maybe it was the colors that carried forward. Yeah.
I kind of had a follow-up to that. Hey, Angela.
Hey, Aaron.
So speaking of the palette and kind of the structure of a lot of your paintings, it seemed to me like the colors that signify the shadows and the colors that signify, or even the way it's painted, generally speaking, the way you symbolize structures and the way you symbolize shadow are very like similar, whereas like a shadow would be like a darker tone, whereas like a person or a silhouette of a person would be like lighter. Is there any deeper meaning in that, or is it just kind of like your artistic style?
Well, I find that I'm kind of drawn to spaces where the figure is often separated somehow from the rest of the, I don't know if I want to call it landscape, but the rest of the scene, I guess. Because I feel like that kind of, it carries information, I guess, to have them separated instead of just part of the same thing. Or it feels a little bit like being outside and then looking in someone's window or something and seeing it glowing in like a completely different world. And I think it's kind of interesting to incorporate two spaces that are quite different within the same architectural space, and then have the separation just be created by the light.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, because you mentioned that like your perception of reality was in question and all of that, and it seemed like in a lot of your paintings it was very neat because the silhouette of a person is very similar to the way a shadow is defined, and that I was wondering if that parody had any kind of like meaningful philosophy behind it.
Interesting. Maybe. I think, yeah, I think that the time I spent painting each person kind of reflected the time that I saw them there. Or if something was in movement, I guess maybe it's a little bit like taking a photo and having a long exposure and something being a little bit blurry. I find that that happens quite often, and not even really intentionally, but if I spend a long time staring at something, it becomes kind of more anchored in the work. But with the questioning the reality thing, I think I've been doing it well forever. I just feel a little bit more comfortable with not resolving it as much anymore.
Mhm.
That's an interesting question.
Thanks.
You have a comment as well in the chat from Myron, just saying that it's so great to hear you talk about your work, Angela.
Myron's here. Hi, Myron.
Awesome. We have a little bit more time if anybody else has any other thoughts or questions.
Hi, Angela.
Hey, Claire.
I have a question as well.
Yeah, sure.
First of all, I just wanted to comment saying that really, really love your new paintings that you've been doing. They're like my favorite, the ones you've been doing this year since COVID. And I kind of just had a question that relates to all of your work, like the structures, because some of them you access like your memories to things or to places you've been or places that you're actually like living in, and then sometimes it's just like imaginary spaces. And I'm just wondering, like, I don't know if you have a preference or if you find that like working with memories as opposed to like imagined spaces, like if you get more out of it like emotionally, or like how that, I don't know if you want to talk about that a bit, if that makes sense.
That's a cool question. Yeah, I think maybe with the memories I get a little bit more like emotionally from it, or I can, it's easier to think about what came before and after and then put a little bit more into the composition, even if it changes. But then I feel like materials kind of do the same thing. If I find like a really interesting scrap lying on my studio floor, then that can also tell a story and end up being quite interesting. So, but the process does feel a little bit different.
Interesting. And then is there like, do you prefer working, like have a preference from working from models or like drawings, or like where your original source imagery kind of comes from for your paintings?
Oh, interesting. No, not really, actually. Even like, I would probably even work from audio. Yeah, I haven't done that yet, but I think that would be really interesting too. Or I haven't made paintings from audio, but I think that it's just, I find it really hard to come up with something out of the blue or just from nothing. And I don't even know if that really exists anyway. But then, yeah. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't really have a preference though.
Yeah, I like the combination of that you use to build up your paintings. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, hey, Dad.
How you doing?
How are you?
I don't have any questions, but I really enjoyed your chat.
Thank you.
Talk and all the things you do.
Thanks, Dad.
You're welcome.
Did you like the Canadian building materials that I used?
You mean the wood?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like all the shadows too. The shadows things really catches your eye. The different shades and shadows and stuff. I noticed. I like it.
Thanks, Dad.
All right, I'll let somebody more interesting ask a question.
No, I love it. I love you.
Okay. Love you too. Bye.
Awesome.
I guess I could ask another question if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
So what's next for you? What's your next big thing?
Oh, good question. I've been doing a lot of drawing, just like in my sketchbook, and I think that I feel like I'm kind of like finding maybe a little bit of a different way of expressing myself in that way. And then also like I'm interested in studying architecture for also what it will do for my art practice, and I really want to make sure that like I keep making paintings and things that are that have no use. You know what I mean? Like I think that making useless things is really important to me. So even though I think like architecture is obviously a little bit more in a design field, I think like I really want to be able to use that to change my creative practice as well.
Okay. But you don't have any like big like art projects lined up right now?
Oh, actually, I'm going to show some paintings at the Rotary Center, actually at the Alternator Center in their window space, probably in June.
That's awesome.
So yeah, so that's the next big thing.
Should walk down there and 6 feet apart and then check it out.
Yeah, I'll give you a distance tour.
Perfect.
I'm actually interested at like just because knowing that you're going to architecture school, I'm interested to see what your installations and your art looks like after going to architecture school, where like right now you think a lot about form and the art of it, but what happens when you put some function into it? And I want to see like what changes, so like how your art changes.
Yeah, maybe I'll rebel and it will have nothing to do with architecture. But yeah, I guess we'll see.
I just wanted to ask a question. Like I really enjoyed the painting. Hey. I really enjoyed it, and I'm just wondering, how do you think it's affected your paintings and your sculpture coming from, I guess, when you're traveling in Spain and everything was kind of different, like every day, as you said, you'd start the day somewhere and that's the first and the last day you'll spend there. But then now with the whole COVID thing, it's kind of like staying almost within the same space every single day.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you think that would affect maybe your understanding of space? And then also the fact that when in France, there was all those protests going on. So there were like a lot of people moving around, a lot of movement, a lot of like that kind of energy. But then now there's more of a lot of space between people, a lot less people.
Yeah.
Outside.
Yeah, I wonder, it will probably affect what I make. I think that I realize that I normally don't make paintings about the reality that I'm in. I usually make them when there's like some sort of removal from my reality and what I'm thinking about, with the exception of that one painting where my roommate's dog is in it. And I think like that stuff could start happening more, where the space that I'm in just kind of becomes more present in the work because it's there all the time. And I really don't want to create a hierarchy between like being here and being there. I mean, I probably do, but I still want to value the present space as well. So if my messy bedroom makes it into my paintings, then I will be happy for it.
Awesome. Anybody else? Any final words? Okay. Well, thanks so much, Angela. This was great. Really appreciate you taking the time to share with us about your artistic practice.
Thank you. I see a message from Jason.
Oh, yes, good job. Would you like me to read it out?
Oh, yes, please.
Sure. Okay, so it says, how does not having a studio space affect the intent of your sculptural work? The smaller hanging ones versus the large wood one. I suppose I'd love a little bit more clarity in whether these works come from the same place.
Oh, interesting. I guess, I mean, I do see a difference between the smaller, the paper ones and the wood one, because of in a way, because of the process, because the larger one took quite a lot of time to make, whereas the other ones could be quite intuitive. But yeah, not having a studio space really changed making some of those, because I found that like in a really clean gallery, those models, they looked really interesting. And in the garage, they look like garbage, like not bad, but just like garbage. So I think that where I work definitely has changed what I want to be making, but yeah, in the future, like I definitely see myself making more sculptures, just probably not for a few months.
Well, I have not a question, but kind of a comment, because when that big wood structure was up, I did mention it to you. I think I went in there one night and just sat there, and you can't hear it really on the video we heard, but it's quite consistent, but it's very low. And when you sit down, it just echoes through the room, just like the shadows echo through the room. And I was just so at peace. I could have actually fallen asleep there. It was really quite an experience in doing that. So thank you. Thank you for that experience this year.
Aw, that means a lot, Ruth. Thanks for bringing that up.
Awesome. And Jason said thanks.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Angela.
Thank you, Kelsey. I'm really grateful for this opportunity and for the Vernon Art Gallery reaching out. It's really nice to be able to talk to people about art again.
Yeah, definitely. We enjoy hearing it. So
Yeah.
yeah. And for those who may be interested, we have our last artist talk coming up on June 4th, and it's Aidan Devin. So feel free to tune in if you're interested. And then we will also post this video onto our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it again, it will be there for you guys. Awesome. Okay. Well, thanks, Angela. I look forward to seeing what you come up with in the future. And thanks to everyone for joining in. It's great to have you here.